Good evening, all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight, we are venturing into the frozen isolation of Alaska, where 10 individuals encountered horrors that should never have existed in civilized America. Small towns buried in snow and darkness, where help is hundreds of miles away, and the nearest neighbor might be hiding the most disturbing secrets imaginable. These are the stories that Alaskan authorities tried to bury. The ones that shattered entire communities and left survivors questioning whether they would ever feel safe again. From trafficking rings operating in plain sight to predators stalking remote homesteads, from underground survivalist cults to killers who hunted humans across the tundra, these accounts will expose the terrifying truth about what happens when isolation meets evil. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now let us step into the shadows of Alaska's forgotten towns, where civilization ends and terror begins. The van died right as Sean was passing through the outskirts of Barrow, that desolate stretch of frozen tundra where even the pack ice seems to watch you with malice. He had been driving back from his 2-week rotation on the North Slope oil fields, ready to collapse in his cabin and sleep for at least 16 hours straight. The work was brutal, 14-hour days in temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in under 2 minutes. But it paid better than anything else a 34-year-old with a GED and a criminal record could hope for. 3 months earlier, Sean had moved to Alaska after his third DUI in Nevada finally convinced him that starting over somewhere far away might be his only option. Utqiagvik in November was like living on another planet. The sun had set on November 18th and would not rise again until mid-January, leaving the town in a perpetual twilight that pressed down on everything like a physical weight. Most people went a little crazy during the polar night. The bars stayed packed, domestic disturbances tripled, and everyone walked around with that hollow look in their eyes like they were waiting for something terrible to happen. Sean had learned to keep his head down, do his work, and not ask questions about the things he sometimes heard echoing across the frozen landscape at 3 a.m. His cabin sat 11 miles outside of town proper, down a service road that the county plowed maybe once a week if he was lucky. It was cheap because it was isolated. A single-room structure built in the 70s by some oil worker who had abandoned it when the loneliness got too heavy. Sean had bought it outright with his signing bonus, grateful to have something that belonged to him for the first time since his divorce. The cabin had propane heat, a generator for electricity, and enough canned food stockpiled to survive a month if the roads became impassable. He had learned quickly that self-sufficiency was not optional this far north. When Sean pulled up to his cabin that night, something felt wrong immediately. The generator was running, which made no sense because he always shut it down before leaving for his rotation. The sound of it hummed through the darkness like a mechanical heartbeat, steady and patient. He sat in his truck for a full minute, engine idling, watching the faint glow of light leaking through the gaps in his window blinds. Maybe he had forgotten to flip the switch in his exhaustion last time. It had happened before, his mind so fried from the work that basic tasks slipped through the cracks. But Sean could not shake the feeling that something was off. The snow around his cabin had been disturbed, not just by wind, but by deliberate movement. Footprints led from the tree line to his front door, then back again, then back to the door, like someone had been pacing, deciding whether to go inside. The prints were fresh, maybe a few hours old, and they were too large to be from a fox or Arctic hare. They were human, and they circled his entire cabin before disappearing back into the darkness toward the coast. Sean grabbed his flashlight and the aluminum baseball bat he kept behind the driver's seat. His phone had 1 bar of signal, enough to maybe get through to the state troopers if things went bad, but the nearest station was in Barrow proper, and response time could be anywhere from 30 minutes to never, depending on what else was happening. He stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching on the ice-crusted snow, and immediately the cold hit him like a fist to the chest. -30 degrees. And that was without factoring in the wind that came screaming off the Arctic Ocean with nothing to slow it down. The front door was unlocked. Sean knew for certain he had locked it before leaving. He always did, had developed an almost obsessive routine of checking it 3 times, a habit carried over from growing up in a neighborhood where people took what they wanted if you gave them an opening. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges shrieking in protest, and swept his flashlight across the interior. Everything looked exactly as he had left it at first glance. His dirty dishes were still in the sink, his work boots by the door, the pile of hunting magazines on the coffee table undisturbed. But then he noticed the small things, the things that made his stomach twist into a knot. Someone had been sleeping in his bed. The blankets were pulled back and rumpled, not the way he had left them folded at the foot of the mattress. His propane stove had been used recently. He could smell the faint odor of burned beans, and there was a pot in the sink he did not recognize, cheap aluminum with a dent in the side. The trash can held empty food containers, his food, things he had stockpiled for emergencies. Someone had been living here, making themselves at home, eating his supplies, and sleeping in his bed like some nightmare version of Goldilocks. Sean backed toward the door, bat raised, his flashlight cutting wild arcs through the shadows. That was when he saw the drawings. They covered the back wall near his bed, crude sketches done in what looked like charcoal, or maybe soot from the stove. They depicted stick figures, dozens of them, arranged in circles. At the center of each circle was a larger figure, taller than the others, with exaggerated hands that reached out to touch the smaller figures. Beneath each drawing were words in a language Sean did not recognize, harsh, angular letters that seemed to crawl across the wall like insects. He heard the breathing before he saw the person. It came from the corner behind the door, slow and measured. The kind of breathing someone does when they're trying very hard to stay quiet, but their body betrays them. Sean spun around, flashlight beam catching a figure pressed against the wall in the shadows. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the figure stepped forward into the light, and Sean found himself staring at a man who looked like he had been living rough for a very long time. The intruder was somewhere in his 40s, maybe older, with a beard matted with ice and dirt. His clothes were layered and mismatched, clearly scavenged, and his eyes held that particular kind of emptiness that Sean had seen before in men who had crossed a line they could never come back from. The man's hands were filthy, fingernails black with grime, and there was something dark crusted under his nails that Sean did not want to think about too carefully. Most disturbing was the knife the man held loosely at his side, a hunting knife with a 6-inch blade that caught the flashlight beam and threw it back in Sean's face. Neither of them spoke at first. The generator continued its steady hum outside, and somewhere in the distance, Sean could hear the wind picking up, promising a storm that would make the roads impassable by morning. The man tilted his head, studying Sean with an expression that was not quite hostile but not friendly either. It was the look of someone evaluating a problem, deciding the best way to solve it. Finally, the man spoke, his voice rough from disuse. "Did not think you would be back for another 3 days." Sean kept the bat raised between them. "This is my cabin. You need to leave, now." The man smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made Sean's skin crawl. "Cannot leave. Nowhere else to go. They're looking for me, or have been looking for months now. This was the only place far enough away that they might not find me." "Who is looking for you?" "The troopers. The FBI. Probably some bounty hunters too by now." The man said it casually, like he was discussing the weather. "I did some things down south, in Fairbanks, in Anchorage. Things I cannot take back. But up here, in the dark, I thought maybe I could just disappear. Thought maybe nobody would care enough to keep looking." Sean's mouth went dry. He was trapped in his own cabin with a fugitive, someone wanted badly enough that multiple agencies were involved. His hand moved slowly toward his pocket, toward his phone, but the man saw the movement and shook his head. "Do not do that," the man said, his voice still calm but carrying a new edge. "I have been watching you. Know your schedule. Know you live alone. Know nobody checks on you. If that phone comes out, I will have to make sure you cannot use it. And I really do not want to do that. I like you. You keep a clean place, good food, and you do not bother anybody. We could work something out. You let me stay here during your rotations and I will be gone before you get back each time. You never have to see me. Never have to know I exist." "That is not happening." Sean's voice was steadier than he felt. "I am walking out that door and I am calling the troopers. You can run if you want. Head into the bush. Take your chances with the cold. But you are not staying here." The man's expression changed then, the false friendliness dropping away to reveal something much darker underneath. "You are not walking anywhere. The storm is coming in. You call anyone, and by the time they get here, you will be frozen solid out there. Or maybe you will not make it to your truck at all. Maybe I will have to make sure of that." Sean realized with growing horror that the man had thought this through. He had been planning for this confrontation, had considered all the angles. The isolation that had seemed like a blessing when Sean moved here now felt like a death sentence. Nobody would hear him scream. Nobody would find his body until spring thaw if the man decided to kill him and dump him somewhere in the endless white expanse. But Sean had not survived this long by being stupid. He had learned in prison that the moment you showed fear, you were finished. He lowered the bat slightly, letting his shoulders relax, and took a step backward toward the door. "All right, maybe we can figure something out. Let me just put this away and we can talk." The man watched him carefully, knife still held ready. "Do not try anything. I have survived worse than you. Did things in Anchorage that would make you sick to hear about. Hurting you would not even register compared to what I have already done." Sean kept moving backward, his hand finding the door handle behind him. "What did you do? Down in Anchorage?" The man's smile returned, cold and devoid of any humanity. "There were 3 of them. A family. Husband thought he could stop me from taking what I needed. He was wrong. The wife tried to run. She was wrong too. And the kid..." He paused, savoring the memory. "The kid just cried. Made it easy." Something inside Sean snapped. He had done bad things in his life, hurt people when he was drunk, made choices he regretted. But this man, this thing standing in his cabin was on a different level entirely. Sean yanked the door open and hurled himself outside, the cold hitting him like a wall as he sprinted toward his truck. Behind him, he heard the man shout, heard boots pounding through the snow in pursuit. Sean's truck was 15 feet away. He could see his breath crystallizing in the beam of the security light, could hear the man closing the distance between them. His fingers found the door handle, yanked it open, and he threw himself inside, slamming the lock down just as the man reached the window. The knife scraped against the glass, leaving a thin scratch, and the man's face pressed against the window, eyes wild with rage. Sean fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking so badly he dropped them twice before getting the key into the ignition. The engine turned over once, twice, and for a heart-stopping moment, he thought it would not start. Then it caught, roaring to life, and he threw the truck into reverse. The man hammered on the window, the knife punching through the glass on the third hit, spiderwebbing the entire pane. Sean floored the accelerator, the truck, fishtailing on the ice before the tires caught, and he rocketed backward down the driveway. In his rearview mirror, he watched the man standing in the middle of the road, knife still in hand, making no effort to chase him further. He simply stood there, watching Sean flee, and somehow that was more terrifying than if he had continued the pursuit. It meant the man was confident. It meant he believed he would have another opportunity. Sean drove straight to the state trooper station in Barrow, his truck struggling through the beginning stages of the storm. By the time he pulled into the parking lot, his hands had stopped shaking, replaced by a cold anger that settled into his bones. The trooper on duty, a woman named Davidson, who Sean had seen around town, listened to his story with an expression that grew increasingly grim. "Did he give you a name?" she asked, already pulling up databases on her computer. "No. But he mentioned Anchorage, said he killed a family there, husband, wife, kid." Davidson's fingers froze over the keyboard. "When did he say this happened?" "Did not give me a timeline. Just said it was down south." She pulled up a file, turned the monitor so Sean could see. The photographs showed a crime scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A small house in Anchorage, walls painted with blood, 3 bodies arranged in what the caption described as a ritualistic pattern. The date stamp read 6 weeks earlier. The suspect was listed as Duncan Mercer, 43 years old, wanted for triple homicide, and suspected in at least 4 other disappearances across Alaska. "That is him," Sean said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That is the man in my cabin." Davidson was already on the radio, calling for backup, organizing a response team. But the storm was getting worse by the minute, and Sean could see the doubt in her eyes. They might not be able to reach his cabin until morning, and by then Duncan Mercer would be gone, vanished back into the vast Alaskan wilderness where men could disappear for years. They found his cabin empty when the troopers finally made it out there 18 hours later. Duncan Mercer had cleared out, taking food and supplies, but leaving the drawings on the wall as a parting message. The forensics team confirmed the DNA found in the cabin matched the samples from the Anchorage crime scene. An APB went out across the state, but weeks turned into months with no sign of Mercer. It was like he had simply ceased to exist. Sean never went back to that cabin. He moved into town, took a room above the bar where at least there were people around, witnesses if something went wrong. He finished his contract with the oil company and left Alaska the day his commitment ended, driving the Alaskan Highway south through Canada, putting as much distance between himself and the Arctic as possible. But sometimes, late at night, he still wakes up thinking about those drawings on his wall, about the cold certainty in Duncan Mercer's eyes, and about the fact that somewhere in Alaska's endless darkness, a monster is still walking free, waiting for the next isolated cabin, the next person foolish enough to think they can hide from the world at the top of the earth. The troopers told him he was lucky, that most people who encountered Duncan Mercer did not live to tell about it. But Sean does not feel lucky. He feels like he glimpsed something that no person should ever have to see. A reminder that even in the modern world, there are still places where the rules do not apply, where evil can thrive in the darkness, patient, and waiting for the next victim to stumble into its path. The last customer stumbled out of the Polaris bar at 2:15 in the morning, and Amelia locked the door behind him with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. She was 29 years old and had been working as the closing bartender at the Polaris for 3 years, ever since she moved to Nome from Juneau, following a breakup that left her with nothing but a Honda Civic and a desperate need to start somewhere new. Nome was not the kind of place people moved to for opportunity. People came here to escape something, or because they had nowhere else to go. The bar sat on Front Street, facing the frozen Bering Sea, and on clear nights, Amelia could see the pack ice stretching out toward Russia like a vast white desert. Tonight, visibility was maybe 20 feet through the blowing snow, and the wind was howling hard enough to rattle the windows in their frames. She had listened to the weather report before her shift started. -45 degrees, with wind chill, whiteout conditions expected to last through morning. The kind of night where going outside without proper gear could kill you in minutes. Amelia finished counting the register, logged the numbers in the book that the owner kept tucked under the bar, and grabbed her parka from the back office. She had parked her car 3 blocks away because the lot behind the bar had been full when she arrived for her shift at 4 in the afternoon. 10 hours of pouring drinks for miners, fishermen, and the handful of tourists crazy enough to visit Alaska in February. Her feet ached, her back ached, and all she wanted was to get home to her apartment above the hardware store, take a hot shower, and sleep until noon. The cold hit her like a physical blow when she stepped outside. Even with her parka zipped to her chin, her face covered with a scarf, and her hands buried in insulated gloves, she could feel the temperature trying to find its way inside, searching for exposed skin to freeze. Her breath came out in clouds that crystallized instantly in the air. She moved quickly down the empty street, her boots crunching on snow that had been packed into ice by weeks of foot traffic. Her car was right where she had left it, covered in a thick layer of snow that she would need to brush off before driving. Amelia pulled her scraper from the back seat and started clearing the windshield, her movements mechanical and tired. She was halfway through when the engine refused to turn over. Once, twice, 3 times she turned the key, and each time the car made that awful grinding sound that meant the battery was dead. Of course it was. Because nothing about this night could be easy. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, weighing her options. She could walk home, but 3 blocks in a heated bar was very different from the 1.5 miles to her apartment in negative 45-degree weather. She could call someone, but her phone showed only 12% battery because she had forgotten to charge it before work. Most of her friends were already asleep, and the few people still awake at this hour were probably drunk and in no condition to drive. That was when she heard the truck pull up behind her, its headlights reflecting off her rearview mirror and flooding the interior of her car with harsh white light. Amelia turned and saw a beat-up Ford with rust eating through the wheel wells. She recognized it immediately. The truck belonged to Marcus Holt, one of the regulars at the Polaris. He came in 3 or 4 times a week, always sat at the end of the bar, and always ordered the same thing. Whiskey, neat, and he would make it last the whole night while reading paperback westerns that he pulled from the pockets of his coat. Marcus got out of his truck and walked over to her window, tapping on the glass with a gloved hand. Amelia rolled down the window just far enough to hear him over the wind. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice muffled by the scarf covering his face. "Battery is dead," Amelia shouted back. "I will try to get a jump in the morning." "You are not walking home in this." It was not a question. "Let me give you a ride. I'm heading that direction anyway." Amelia hesitated. She knew Marcus well enough to serve him drinks, knew he worked at one of the gold processing facilities outside of town, knew he kept to himself and never caused trouble. But getting into a stranger's truck in the middle of the night, in weather that could kill her if something went wrong, felt like the beginning of every true crime story she had ever heard. Still, walking home was not an option, and her phone was dying. She made the calculation that most people make in moments like this, weighing fear against necessity. "All right," she said, grabbing her purse and locking her car. "I appreciate it." The interior of Marcus's truck was warm, the heater blasting at full strength, and the sudden temperature change made Amelia's face sting. Marcus pulled back onto Front Street and headed west, driving slowly through the blowing snow. For the first few minutes, neither of them spoke. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the accumulation, and visibility was so poor that Marcus had to lean forward over the steering wheel, squinting to see the road. "Hell of a night," he said eventually, his voice casual. "You get off late?" "Always do on Saturdays," Amelia replied, her hands still shaking from the cold. "Bar does not close until 2. "Must be tough walking to your car this late. Dangerous, too." Something about the way he said it made Amelia glance at him, but his expression was unreadable in the dim light from the dashboard. They were passing the library now, which meant her apartment was just another 6 blocks straight ahead. She could already picture her bed, the warm blankets, the oblivion of sleep. But Marcus did not turn at the next intersection. He kept driving straight, past the hardware store where Amelia lived, past the school and the post office, heading toward the outskirts of town where the buildings thinned out and the tundra took over. "You just missed my street," Amelia said, her voice carefully neutral. "I live above the hardware store." "I know," Marcus said, and his tone had changed. The casual friendliness was gone, replaced by something flat and deliberate. "But I need to show you something first. Will not take long." Amelia's hand moved slowly toward the door handle, her mind racing through options. The truck was moving at maybe 20 miles per hour, slow enough that she could potentially jump out, but in this weather, without proper shelter nearby, she would be dead within an hour. Her phone was in her purse on her lap, but with 12% battery and questionable signal, calling for help was a gamble. "Marcus, I really need to get home," she said, keeping her voice steady. "My roommate is expecting me. She texted earlier asking when I would be back." It was a lie. Amelia lived alone, but she hoped the implication of someone waiting for her might change his mind about whatever he was planning. Marcus glanced at her, and in the glow from the dashboard she saw him smile. It was not a friendly smile. "Your roommate," he repeated, drawing the words out. "That is funny, because I have seen you carrying groceries up to your apartment plenty of times, always alone, never seen anyone else coming or going. You live by yourself, Amelia, just like I do." The fear that had been building in her chest crystallized into something cold and sharp. He had been watching her, studying her routine, learning her schedule, waiting for an opportunity exactly like this. The dead battery, the late hour, the storm that would keep everyone else off the roads. None of it was coincidence. They were well outside of town now, the last streetlight disappearing behind them. Marcus turned onto a dirt road that Amelia recognized as leading to one of the old gold mining camps that dotted the area around Nome. Places that had been abandoned decades ago when the easy gold ran out, leaving behind rusted equipment and collapsing buildings that nobody bothered to tear down. "There is nothing out here," Amelia said, her hand gripping the door handle. "Whatever you want to show me can wait until morning." "No," Marcus said, his voice still calm. "It cannot wait. Do you know how many people have gone missing from Nome? 24 between 1960 and 2004. The FBI investigated, blamed it on alcohol and the cold, said people just wandered off drunk and froze to death. But that is not what happened to all of them." He pulled the truck to a stop in front of a building that might have been a processing facility once. 3 stories of weathered wood and corrugated metal, its windows dark and empty. Marcus killed the engine but left the headlights on, their beams cutting through the snow to illuminate the entrance. "Some of them disappeared because someone made them disappear," Marcus continued. "Someone who knew the land, knew how to hide things where they would never be found. Someone who understood that in a place like Nome, where people come and go all the time, a few missing persons do not raise too many questions." Amelia's hand found her phone, and she managed to unlock the screen and start dialing 911 before Marcus noticed. He grabbed her wrist, squeezing hard enough to make her drop the phone. It fell between the seats, the screen glowing weakly in the darkness. "That was stupid," Marcus said, and for the first time she heard anger in his voice. "Now you have made this harder than it needed to be." He reached across her and pushed open the passenger door, the wind immediately howling into the cab of the truck, bringing with it a blast of cold that stole her breath. "Get out," he ordered. "Walk to the building. Try to run, and I will make sure you freeze before you get 100 yards. Amelia knew he was right. She could see nothing but white in every direction, no lights, no landmarks, nothing that would tell her which way town was. Without the truck, without shelter, she would be dead in minutes. Her only chance was to stay near the building, stay near the headlights, and hope that help would somehow find her. She stumbled out into the snow, the wind nearly knocking her off her feet. Marcus came around the truck, a flashlight in one hand and something else in the other that Amelia could not make out through the blowing snow. He pushed her toward the building, and she forced herself to move, each step an act of will against the screaming instinct to fight, to run, to do anything except walk toward what was almost certainly her death. The building's door hung crooked on its hinges, and inside the temperature was barely warmer than outside. Marcus's flashlight beams swept across the interior, revealing rusted machinery and collapsed sections of ceiling. He guided her deeper into the structure, past rooms filled with debris, until they reached a stairwell leading down. "Keep moving," he said, and Amelia realized with horror that he had been here before, many times. This was not improvisation, this was routine. The stairs descended into what must have been a storage basement, and the walls changed from wood to concrete. Marcus's flashlight illuminated a space about 20 feet square, empty except for a single chair bolted to the floor in the center. On the walls, Amelia could see marks, scratches, as if someone had been clawing at the concrete with their fingernails. Dozens of scratches, maybe hundreds, layered over each other. "How many?" Amelia whispered, her voice barely audible over her own ragged breathing. "How many people have you brought here?" Marcus did not answer. He grabbed her arm and tried to force her toward the chair, but something inside Amelia snapped. The fear was still there, but underneath it was rage. Rage that this man thought he could take. Her life, that he had taken others, that he had been living among them in Nome, drinking at the bar where she worked, watching and waiting. She drove her elbow backward into his stomach, felt him grunt with surprise more than pain, and twisted away from his grip. Her hand found something metal on the ground, a piece of old pipe, and she swung it at his head with all her strength. The pipe connected with a sound like a hammer hitting meat, and Marcus went down hard, the flashlight spinning across the floor. Amelia did not wait to see if he would get up. She grabbed the flashlight and ran for the stairs, her boots slipping on ice and debris. Behind her, she heard Marcus groaning, heard him moving, but she did not look back. Up the stairs, through the building, out into the storm. The truck was still there, headlights still on, keys still in the ignition, because Marcus had been that confident she would not escape. She threw herself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely shift into gear, but adrenaline carried her through. She swung the truck around and aimed it back toward where she hoped the main road was, driving blind through the whiteout, knowing only that she needed to put distance between herself and that building. It took her 20 minutes to find the main road, following tire tracks that had not quite filled in with snow. Another 30 minutes to reach Nome, to pull up to the state trooper station to stumble inside and collapse. The troopers found Marcus 3 hours later, still in the basement, suffering from a concussion and hypothermia. The investigation that followed turned up remains. Not 24 bodies, but 7 that could be identified through dental records and DNA. 7 people who had gone missing from Nome over the past 15 years. 7 people whose families finally had answers. Amelia left Nome 2 weeks later, moved back to Juneau, and took a job working day shifts at a coffee shop where she could see the entrance at all times. She still cannot get into a vehicle with someone she does not know well. Still checks her apartment 3 times before bed to make sure the doors are locked. And sometimes, on nights when the wind howls and the temperature drops, she wakes up thinking she is back in that basement, surrounded by the scratches of women who did not get away, and she has to remind herself that she survived, that she fought back, that she is one of the lucky ones. But luck is a strange thing to feel grateful for when 7 others were not as fortunate, when their final moments were in that basement, and when she knows that if her hand had not found that pipe, her scratches would be on those walls too. Jacob Reeves had spent 20 years investigating the paranormal, chasing stories that most people dismissed as folklore or delusion. At 41 years old, he had visited supposedly haunted houses from Maine to California, explored abandoned asylums, and spent countless nights in cemeteries with nothing but recording equipment and hope. Most of it had yielded nothing concrete, just shadows and sounds that could be explained away by drafts and settling foundations. But Portlock, Alaska was different. Portlock had a history that even skeptics could not easily dismiss. The village sat on the southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula, abandoned since 1950 after decades of unexplained disappearances and violent deaths. The official story was that residents left for better opportunities when Alaska Route 1 was constructed, making access to larger towns easier. But the unofficial story, the one passed down through Aleut families and whispered in the bars of nearby communities, was far darker. Something had hunted the people of Portlock, something that left bodies torn apart in ways that no bear or wolf could manage. The locals called it Nantinak, a creature from their legends, half human and half-beast that stalked the forests and punished those who did not show respect. Jacob had flown into Homer and hired a boat to take him around the coast to the ruins of Portlock. The captain, an older man named Davis, who had fished these waters for 30 years, had been reluctant to make the trip. He told Jacob that most people who visited Portlock came back different, quieter, with something behind their eyes that had not been there before. Some did not come back at all, but money was money, and Davis agreed to drop Jacob off with enough supplies for 3 days and return to pick him up on the 4th morning. The ruins emerged from the forest like broken teeth. Collapsed buildings overgrown with moss and devil's club, rusted equipment from the old cannery half buried in decades of accumulated vegetation. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of waves against the rocky shore and the occasional cry of ravens overhead. Jacob set up his base camp in what had once been the post office, the most intact structure remaining. The building still had 3 walls and most of its roof, enough to provide shelter from the elements. He spent the first day exploring the site, photographing the remnants of the town and recording notes on his handheld recorder. There were personal effects scattered throughout the ruins, dishes still on tables in collapsed homes, tools left where they had been dropped, signs that people had left quickly and without taking everything. It supported the stories he had heard that the exodus had been sudden, driven by fear rather than economic opportunity. As afternoon faded into evening, Jacob noticed how quickly darkness came to this part of Alaska in October. The sun dropped behind the mountains, and within what seemed like minutes, the forest was black as pitch. His LED lanterns created a small bubble of light in the post office, but beyond that radius, the darkness was absolute. He heated a freeze-dried meal on his camp stove and reviewed the footage he had captured during the day, looking for anything unusual. Nothing yet, just an abandoned town slowly being reclaimed by nature. The first sound came around 10 o'clock, a loud crack like a tree branch snapping under immense weight, somewhere in the forest behind the post office. Jacob grabbed his flashlight and swept the beam across the tree line, but the light only penetrated maybe 30 feet before being swallowed by the darkness. He waited, listening, and heard nothing more. Probably just a branch falling, weakened by rot and finally giving way. But 20 minutes later, he heard it again, this time closer and accompanied by what sounded like heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush. Not the careful movements of a deer or the quick scurrying of smaller animals, but deliberate, measured steps. Something large, moving with purpose. Jacob's rational mind told him it was probably a moose or brown bear. The peninsula had healthy populations of both, and either could make sounds that seemed ominous in the dark. He stepped outside the post office, his flashlight cutting a path through the darkness. The footsteps had stopped, but he could feel something watching him. It was not imagination or paranoia feeding on isolation. It was the distinct physical sensation of being observed. The same feeling you get when someone stares at the back of your head in a crowded room. His breath came faster, visible in the cold air, and he backed slowly toward the post office entrance. That was when he heard the vocalization. It started low, almost subsonic, a rumble that he felt in his chest before he consciously registered it as sound. Then it rose in pitch, becoming a guttural howl that echoed off the surrounding mountains. It was not a bear. Bears made sounds Jacob was familiar with, grunts and woofs and the occasional roar. This was something else entirely, a sound that seemed designed to communicate intelligence and intent. The howl went on for maybe 15 seconds before cutting off abruptly, leaving silence that felt heavier than before. Jacob scrambled back into the post office and pulled the door closed, his hands shaking as he wedged a broken beam against it to keep it from opening. He told himself he was being irrational, that animals made all kinds of sounds in the wild, and the acoustics of the mountains could distort them into something unrecognizable. But his body was not listening to his rational mind. His heart hammered against his ribs, and sweat had soaked through his thermal shirt despite the cold. He set up his night vision camera facing the door and positioned his audio recorder to capture anything outside. Then he settled in to wait, sitting with his back against the far wall where he could see both the door and the collapsed section of roof above him. The LED lantern cast shifting shadows across the interior, and Jacob found himself staring at those shadows, watching them move in ways that did not quite match the lantern's sway. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time they circled the post office, heavy impacts on the forest floor that Jacob could feel through the building's foundation. Whatever was out there was massive, far larger than any bear he had encountered in his years of wilderness exploration. The footsteps paused at the door, and Jacob heard breathing, deep, deliberate inhalations and exhalations, as if something was smelling the air, trying to determine what was inside the building. Then came the scratching, long drawn-out scrapes against the wooden wall, moving from ground level to well above where a bear standing on its hind legs could reach. The sound went on for minutes, methodical and patient, like the thing outside was testing the structure, looking for weaknesses. Jacob pressed record on his audio equipment and lifted his camera, pointing it toward the door, even though he knew the footage would show nothing but darkness beyond his lantern's glow. The scratching stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Jacob allowed himself to breathe, to think that maybe whatever it was had lost interest and moved on. Then the entire building shook as something massive slammed against the exterior wall. The impact was hard enough to dislodge bits of the ceiling, sending dust and debris raining down. Jacob scrambled backward, his camera falling from his hands, as another impact hit the building, this time from a different direction. It was trying to get in. The methodical testing had given way to aggressive assault, and the old post office, already compromised by 70 years of neglect, was not going to withstand much more. A third impact hit the door, and Jacob heard the wood beginning to splinter. The beam he had wedged against it shifted, and he could see the door bowing inward. Jacob grabbed his flashlight and looked up at the collapsed section of roof. There was maybe a 2-foot gap between the remaining structure and the open air, just large enough for a person to squeeze through if they were desperate enough. He dragged his pack over to the wall, climbed on top of it, and pulled himself up through the opening. Splinters tore at his jacket, and something sharp cut across his forehead, but he forced himself through and rolled out onto what remained of the roof. Below him, he heard the door finally give way with a crack like a gunshot. Heavy footsteps entered the building, and through the gap in the roof, Jacob saw movement. Something massive and dark, moving with a fluidity that seemed wrong for anything that size. It stopped in the center of the post office, and Jacob held his breath, pressing himself flat against the remaining roof panels. The thing below him made a sound, a low rumble that might have been frustration or might have been communication. Jacob risked a look through the gap and immediately wished he had not. In the glow from his overturned LED lantern, he caught a glimpse of what was in his camp. It stood upright, maybe 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair, with arms that seemed too long for its body. But it was the face that paralyzed him with fear. Even in the poor light, he could see enough to know it was not entirely animal. There was structure there, features that suggested something closer to human than should have been possible. The creature bent down and picked up Jacob's camera, turning it over in hands that had opposable thumbs, and manipulated the device with clear purpose. It looked at the camera for a long moment, then raised its head and looked directly at the gap in the roof where Jacob was hiding. Their eyes met, and Jacob felt his bladder let go, warmth spreading through his pants as pure terror short-circuited every rational thought in his brain. Then the creature roared, a sound so loud and full of rage that Jacob's ears rang. It hurled the camera against the wall, shattering it into pieces, and began tearing through his equipment, destroying everything he had brought. Jacob did not wait to see more. He scrambled across the roof, dropped to the ground on the opposite side of the building, and ran. He had no plan, no destination, just the primal need to put distance between himself and the thing in the post office. His flashlight beam bounced wildly as he crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping his face, roots trying to trip him. Behind him, he heard the creature emerge from the building, heard its footsteps pounding after him, impossibly fast for something that size. Jacob's lungs burned, his legs screamed, but terror kept him moving. He broke through the tree line onto the rocky beach, the ocean stretching black and infinite before him. He had nowhere left to run. The creature would be on him in seconds, and there was nothing he could do to stop what was about to happen. That was when he remembered the flare gun in his jacket pocket, part of his emergency kit in case he needed to signal Davis early. Jacob fumbled for it, his fingers numb and clumsy, and managed to load a flare just as the creature burst from the forest behind him. He spun and fired without aiming, the flare rocketing toward the thing and exploding in a burst of red phosphorus. The creature recoiled, throwing an arm up to shield its face, and Jacob fired again, his last flare. This one hit the ground between them and continued to burn, creating a wall of red light and smoke. The creature backed away, making sounds that might have been pain or anger or both, and retreated into the forest. Jacob collapsed on the beach, gasping, his entire body shaking. He sat there until dawn, watching the tree line, expecting at any moment for the creature to return. But it did not. As the first gray light of morning began to illuminate the ruins of Portlock, Jacob used his satellite phone to call Davis and beg him to come early. The Coast Guard arrived with Davis, having picked up Jacob's distress signal. They searched the post office and found his equipment destroyed, found massive tracks in the soft earth around the building, but they found no creature. The official report stated that Jacob had been attacked by a brown bear, common in the area, and had successfully defended himself with signal flares. His camera and audio equipment had been destroyed, conveniently eliminating any evidence of what he had actually encountered. Jacob returned to the lower 48 and stopped taking investigation jobs. He sold his equipment, closed his website, and took a job teaching high school history in Oregon. When people asked why he left the paranormal field, he gave vague answers about wanting stability. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying. He had found what he was looking for in Portlock, had confirmation that something unexplained existed in those ruins, and that knowledge, rather than validating his life's work, had broken something fundamental inside him. Some mysteries, he learned, are better left unsolved. Some places are abandoned for good reason, and some creatures are real, regardless of what anyone wants to believe. Mia Henderson had worked as a forensic records clerk for the Talkeetna Police Department for 11 years, and in that time she thought she had seen everything the small mountain town could produce. Domestic disputes, bar fights, the occasional theft, and more DUIs than she could count. At 38 years old, she had settled into a comfortable routine of filing reports, digitizing old records, and maintaining the evidence room in the basement of the municipal building. It was steady work, predictable, and it left her with enough mental energy to care for her aging mother, who lived with her in a small house on the east side of town. The basement had always been a mess. Decades of files crammed into metal shelving units, boxes stacked on top of other boxes, everything covered in a layer of dust that suggested nobody had conducted a proper inventory since the 80s. When Chief Morrison announced the department would be upgrading to a new digital system, Mia volunteered to lead the project of sorting through the old files and determining what needed to be preserved and what could be destroyed according to state retention guidelines. She started in the far corner of the basement where the oldest files were kept, working backward through time. Most of it was routine paperwork from investigations that had been resolved decades ago. But 3 weeks into the project, Mia found a banker's box that had been pushed behind a filing cabinet, hidden from casual view. The box was unmarked, except for a piece of masking tape that read 1983-1989 open cases in faded handwriting. Inside were 17 case files, all unsolved deaths that had occurred in and around Talkeetna during that 6-year period. Mia spread them out on the basement floor, organizing them chronologically, and began reading through the details. What she found made her skin crawl. Each victim had been found in a remote cabin, discovered weeks or sometimes months after their death. Each body had been frozen solid, which made determining exact time of death difficult. But what disturbed Mia most was the positioning of the bodies. According to the case files and the photographs that accompanied them, each victim had been found sitting upright in a chair, hands folded in their lap, facing a window. Their expressions were described as peaceful, almost serene, despite the violent trauma visible on their bodies. Ligature marks on wrists and ankles suggested they had been restrained at some point, though the restraints were always removed before death. The medical examiner's reports noted evidence of prolonged captivity, malnutrition, and systematic abuse before the victims finally succumbed to hypothermia. The 17 cases spanned those 6 years, then stopped abruptly in early 1989. The lead investigator, a detective named Thomas Crane, had written extensive notes suggesting the deaths were connected, the work of a single individual who had detailed knowledge of the area's abandoned cabins and mining structures. But the investigation had gone cold, literally and figuratively, when Detective Crane died of a heart attack in 1990. After his death, nobody had picked up the cases. They had been boxed up and forgotten. And Mia photographed every page with her phone and spent the next week researching on her own time. She cross-referenced the victim names with missing person reports, tracked down family members through social media, and built a timeline of the murders. What emerged was a pattern that Detective Crane had identified but never had the chance to pursue fully. The cabins where victims were found formed a rough circle around Talkeetna, each one approximately 15 to 20 miles from town, each one accessible only by snow machine or hiking in the winter months. Then Mia made a connection that chilled her to her core. She pulled recent death records from the past 3 years and found 4 cases that had been ruled accidental deaths due to exposure. Hikers and hunters who had gone missing and been found weeks later in remote locations. She requested the full reports and photographs from the state medical examiner, claiming she needed them for database completion, and when they arrived, her worst fears were confirmed. The recent victims showed the same positioning, sitting upright, hands folded, facing windows. The same ligature marks hidden beneath clothing that the initial responders had not noticed or thought to document. The same evidence of prolonged captivity that had been explained away as the natural progression of hypothermia and predation by scavengers. The killer had not stopped in 1989. They had simply gotten better at making the deaths look accidental. Mia took her findings to Chief Morrison, spreading the files across his desk and walking him through the connections she had made. Morrison listened, his expression growing more troubled as she presented the evidence. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. "This is going to be complicated," he said finally. "The recent deaths were investigated by state troopers, not us. The old cases are outside any reasonable statute of limitations for all but the most serious charges, and we have no suspects, no leads, nothing to indicate who might have done this or whether they are even still alive. But we have to do something," Mia insisted. "Someone out there killed at least 21 people over 35 years. They could still be active. There could be more victims we have not found yet." Morrison agreed to contact the state police and request they reopen the investigations into the recent deaths. He also assigned Mia to continue compiling evidence from the old cases to build as complete a picture as possible before bringing in outside agencies. But that night, as Mia drove home in the darkness, she could not shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her house sat at the end of a dead-end street, bordered by forest on 3 sides. She had always loved the privacy, the way the trees created a natural barrier between her and the neighbors. But pulling into her driveway that night, the trees seemed menacing rather than protective. Her motion sensor lights flickered on as she approached, illuminating her front yard in harsh white light. Inside, her mother was already asleep. Mia checked the locks on all the doors and windows, something she had never felt compelled to do before, and settled at her kitchen table with her laptop to continue her research. She was cross-referencing property records for the cabins where bodies had been found when her phone rang. The number was blocked, showing only unknown caller on the screen. Mia almost did not answer, but something made her pick up. Hello? Silence on the other end. Not dead air, but the kind of silence that comes from someone deliberately not speaking while listening intently. Mia could hear breathing, slow and measured. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she felt. The line went dead. Mia set her phone down, her hands trembling slightly. Wrong number, she told herself. Just someone who dialed incorrectly and hung up when they realized their mistake. But 15 minutes later, it rang again. Same blocked number. This time when she answered, a voice spoke. "You should stop looking at old files," the voice said. It was electronically distorted, pitch lower than natural speech, impossible to identify. Some things are meant to stay buried. Before Mia could respond, the line disconnected. She immediately called Chief Morrison, but his phone went to voicemail. She left a message explaining what had happened and asked him to have a patrol car swing by her house. Then she went through the house again, checking every lock, every window, making sure nothing was open or unlocked. The patrol car arrived 20 minutes later. Officer Yazzie walked the perimeter of Mia's property, found no signs of disturbance, and promised to increase patrols in the neighborhood for the next few nights. But after he left, Mia sat in her living room with the lights off, watching the street through a gap in her curtains, unable to shake the conviction that someone was out there watching her house. The next morning, Mia went straight to the evidence room and secured all the case files in the department's safe. She made digital copies of everything and uploaded them to a cloud storage service, then emailed the links to her personal account and to Chief Morrison. If something happened to the physical files, or to her, at least the information would still exist somewhere. That afternoon, Morrison called her into his office. "State police are sending a detective up tomorrow to review what you found. In the meantime, I want you to take a few days off. Go visit your sister in Anchorage, get some distance from this." "I'm not running," Mia said. "If someone is trying to scare me leaving, town is exactly what they want. It is not about running. It is about keeping you safe until we figure out who made those calls and what they want." Mia reluctantly agreed, but instead of going to Anchorage, she checked herself and her mother into a hotel in Wasilla, 30 miles south. She figured if someone was watching her house, they would not expect her to stay local. The hotel room had 2 queen beds and a decent internet connection, and Mia spent the evening continuing her research while her mother watched television. She was deep into property records when she found something that made her heart stop. One name appeared repeatedly in connection with the remote cabins where bodies had been found. The properties had changed hands over the years through inheritance and sale, but in the early 80s, they had all been owned or managed by the same person, a man named Gerald Voss, who had worked as a property manager for a mining company that owned numerous parcels of land around Talkeetna. Mia searched for information about Gerald Voss and found an obituary from 1989. He had died in a hunting accident, shot in the chest by an unknown assailant, his body found near one of the very cabins where a victim had been discovered months earlier. The investigation into his death had been inconclusive, eventually ruled as a possible suicide or accidental discharge during cleaning. But if Gerald Voss died in 1989, who had been killing people for the past 30 years? Mia dug deeper and found that Voss had a son, Curtis Voss, born in 1970. Curtis would be 55 now, and a quick search revealed he still lived in Talkeetna, working as a wilderness guide and operating a small charter service flying clients to remote hunting and fishing locations. His business had access to dozens of remote cabins across the region. Mia called Morrison immediately and shared what she had found. He promised to pass the information to the state police detective who was already en route. But that night, lying in the hotel bed, with her mother snoring softly in the next bed, Mia could not sleep. She kept thinking about Curtis Voss, about how someone who grew up around those cabins would know every remote structure for 100 miles, would understand the seasonal patterns of hunters and hikers, would know exactly when and where someone could be taken without anyone noticing. The knock on the hotel room door came at 3 a.m. Mia jerked awake, her heart pounding, and looked through the peephole. A man in a security uniform stood in the hallway, but something about his posture was wrong, too stiff, too deliberate. She backed away from the door without speaking. "Ms. Henderson," the man called through the door. "Security, we had a report of a disturbance in this room. I need to do a welfare check." Mia grabbed her phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher confirmed no one from the hotel had called security to her room. Police were being dispatched, but the man outside was trying the door handle now, testing the lock. Mia woke her mother, and they barricaded themselves in the bathroom, the phone on speaker, as the dispatcher stayed on the line. The lock held, and police arrived within 7 minutes. The man was gone by then, but hotel security footage showed Curtis Voss in a stolen uniform walking the hallway, stopping at Mia's door. A warrant was issued immediately, and state troopers arrested Curtis Voss at his home before dawn. The evidence found in his house included journals detailing every victim, photographs that had never been part of official case files, and maps marking dozens of remote locations around Talkeetna. Some marked sites corresponded to known victims, others did not. Search teams would eventually find 4 more bodies in locations Curtis had marked but never used again, victims from years ago that no one had ever reported missing. Mia testified at the trial, explaining how she had uncovered the pattern of deaths and connected them across decades. Curtis Voss was convicted of 12 counts of murder, and prosecutors estimated the actual number of victims was likely higher. The remote wilderness of Alaska had concealed his crimes for over 30 years, and would have continued to do so if Mia had not found that forgotten box in a dusty basement. She returned to work, but requested a transfer out of the evidence room. Some connections, once made, could not be unmade, and knowing how close she had come to becoming another carefully posed victim in a frozen cabin was something Mia would carry with her forever. Zachary Cole had lived in Whittier, Alaska for 8 years, and in that time he had never quite gotten used to how strange the town was. At 36 years old, he worked as a maintenance technician for Baggage Towers, the 14-story concrete building where nearly all of Whittier's 200 permanent residents lived under one roof. The building had been constructed as an army barracks during World War II, converted to civilian use in the 70s, and now served as a self-contained community with apartments, a school, a post office, and a general store, all connected by interior hallways. It was efficient in a way that made sense when winter storms could trap the town for days, but it also felt claustrophobic, like living inside a concrete organism that breathed and shifted around you. Zachary had taken the maintenance job after his commercial fishing boat sank in a storm off Kodiak Island. The settlement from his insurance company was enough to buy a small condo on the 7th floor of Baggage Towers and cover his expenses while he figured out what to do next. That had been 8 years ago, and he was still figuring. The work was steady, if not exciting, replacing light fixtures, unclogging drains, patching drywall, and keeping the aging infrastructure functional enough that people could live comfortably. He knew every inch of the building, from the occupied apartments to the storage areas in the basement, to the abandoned floors that had been sealed off decades ago when the population declined and maintaining empty spaces became too expensive. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in November. Mrs. Chen on the 9th floor reported a smell coming from the wall behind her bedroom closet, something dead and rotten that was getting worse. Zachary grabbed his tool bag and headed up, expecting to find a rat that had died in the wall cavity. It happened sometimes in a building this old. Animals found their way in through gaps and expired in places that were difficult to access. Mrs. Chen met him at her door, a handkerchief pressed to her nose. "It started 3 days ago," she said, her voice muffled. "Thought it would go away, but it keeps getting stronger." Zachary could smell it as soon as he entered the apartment, a sickly, sweet odor that made his eyes water. He followed it to the bedroom and opened the closet door. The smell intensified, and he pulled his shirt up over his nose and mouth before examining the back wall. The drywall looked undisturbed, but he could feel cold air coming from somewhere, a draft that suggested a gap behind the wall. He used his stud finder to locate the support beams, then carefully cut a hole in the drywall large enough to shine a flashlight through. What he saw made him pull back in confusion. There was a space behind the wall, maybe 3 feet deep, and it extended farther than his flashlight beam could reach. The smell was coming from something down in the darkness, but Zachary could not see what. "Mrs. Chen, I need to make this hole bigger," he called out. "There is some kind of void back here that should not exist according to the building plans." He spent the next hour carefully removing a section of drywall large enough to climb through. The space beyond was a narrow corridor, unfinished concrete, and exposed pipes running parallel to the apartments. His flashlight revealed it extended the entire length of the building, with occasional gaps where stairs descended to lower levels. According to the architectural plans Zachary had studied, this space did not exist. The building should have had solid walls between the apartments and the exterior concrete shell. The smell led him down one of the staircases, into progressively older sections of the structure. The air grew colder, and he could see his breath in the flashlight beam. At what he calculated was the 3rd floor, he found a door that had been hidden behind a false wall. The door was heavy steel, institutional, with a lock that looked like it had been forced open recently. Zachary pushed the door open and swept his flashlight across the interior. He was looking at what appeared to be an apartment, but one that had been sealed off from the rest of the building. The furniture was from the 70s, covered in dust but otherwise intact. A television sat on a stand, unplugged. A table held dishes that still contained dried remnants of food, and everywhere, scattered across every surface, were personal belongings. Photographs, jewelry, wallets, identification cards, all from different people spanning decades. His flashlight beam found the source of the smell. In the corner of the room, partially hidden behind a couch, was a body in an advanced state of decomposition. Zachary backed out of the room immediately and pulled out his phone, but there was no signal this deep in the building. He needed to get back to Mrs. Chen's apartment and call the police. He was climbing back up the hidden staircase when he heard a door close somewhere above him. Footsteps echoed in the narrow corridor, moving toward him with purpose. Zachary killed his flashlight and pressed himself against the wall, his heart hammering. The footsteps stopped near where he was hiding, and he heard breathing. Someone listening just as intently as he was. Then a voice spoke, calm and familiar. "Zachary, I know you're in there. I saw you go into Mrs. Chen's apartment. Saw you cut through the wall. You should not have done that." It was Raymond Dietrich, the building superintendent. He had worked at Baggage Towers for over 30 years, longer than anyone else. He was the one who hired Zachary, who showed him the maintenance systems, who had access to every key and every locked door in the building. Zachary did not respond, did not move. He heard Raymond sigh, a sound of disappointment rather than anger. "I kept them comfortable," Raymond continued, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "The ones I brought here. Gave them food, water, kept them warm. They were people nobody would miss. Drifters passing through, workers on short-term contracts, tourists who made poor decisions. Whittier is the perfect place for this. Only one road in and out, and it goes through a tunnel that can be closed. Everyone lives in one building, so strangers stand out unless they're with someone who belongs." Zachary's hand found his phone. Still no signal, but he opened the voice recorder app and hit record, hoping it would capture something useful if he did not make it out. The building has so many hidden spaces, Raymond went on. Built during the war, when they were paranoid about Soviet attacks. Secret passages, sealed floors, rooms that exist on the original blueprints but were walled off and forgotten. I have had decades to explore them, to understand how to move through the building without being seen. Nobody questions the superintendent checking on things. Nobody wonders why I am in sections of the building that are supposedly empty. Zachary heard the footsteps start moving again, descending the stairs toward him. He had two choices: try to go up and risk running into Raymond in the narrow corridor, or go down and hope there was another way out through the abandoned floors. He chose down, moving as quickly as he dared in the darkness, his hands finding the walls to guide him. Behind him, Raymond's footsteps accelerated. Running just makes it harder, Zachary. You are a good worker. I liked you, but you have seen too much now, and I cannot have you telling people about the rooms. Cannot have investigators crawling through my building, disturbing what I have built here. Zachary reached the bottom of the stairs and found himself in what must have been the basement level. His flashlight revealed a maze of pipes and machinery, the building's mechanical systems humming and clicking in the darkness. He could hear water rushing through pipes, could feel the vibration of the heating system through the concrete floor. Somewhere in this maze had to be access to the street level, a service entrance, or emergency exit that maintenance workers used. Raymond's flashlight beam appeared at the top of the stairs, sweeping back and forth. "You know there is nowhere to go down there," he called down. "I control all the exits. I control who comes in and who goes out. That has always been my job, keeping the building secure." Zachary moved deeper into the mechanical room, squeezing between pipes, searching desperately for any door or ladder that might lead out. His hand found something cold and metal, a ventilation duct large enough for a person to crawl through. He could feel air moving, which meant it led somewhere. He pulled off the access panel, the screws having rusted away years ago, and climbed inside. The duct was barely wide enough for his shoulders, and the metal was slick with condensation. Zachary pulled himself forward on his elbows, his flashlight clamped between his teeth, trying not to think about getting stuck or about Raymond following him into the confined space. The duct angled upward, and Zachary had to use his knees and forearms to inch his way along, his breath coming in gasps that echoed metallically around him. Behind him, he heard Raymond enter the duct. "This just connects to the main air handling system on the second floor," Raymond called out, his voice distorted by the metal walls. "There is no exit that way. You're just prolonging the inevitable." But Zachary kept crawling, because stopping meant accepting what Raymond had planned for him. The duct branched, and he took the path that angled most steeply upward, betting that it would lead to occupied floors where there would be people, witnesses, safety. His hands were numb from the cold metal, and his knees were bruised and bleeding through his work pants, but he kept moving. The duct opened into a larger chamber, the main air handling unit for the building. Massive fans rotated slowly, pushing air through the system, and the noise was deafening. Zachary pulled himself out of the duct and looked around desperately for an exit. There, on the far wall, was a door marked "Mechanical Room, Authorized Personnel Only." He sprinted for it, his footsteps lost in the roar of the fans. The door was unlocked, and he burst through into a stairwell that he recognized as the Eastern Emergency Stairs, one of the main vertical arteries of the building. He took the stairs up 3 at a time, his legs burning, not stopping, until he reached the ground floor where the police office was located. The Alaska State Trooper stationed in Whittier listened to Zachary's story with an expression that grew increasingly grim. A search team was assembled within the hour, and they descended into the hidden spaces of Beggish Towers with Zachary as their reluctant guide. What they found would take weeks to fully catalog. 7 bodies in various states of decomposition in the sealed apartment. Personal belongings from 23 individuals scattered throughout the hidden corridors. And Raymond Dietrich, who had barricaded himself in a section of the abandoned 4th floor and refused to come out. The standoff lasted 16 hours before Raymond finally surrendered. The investigation revealed that over 30 years, he had used the building's hidden infrastructure to kidnap and imprison people, keeping them alive for weeks or months in the sealed spaces before they eventually died from neglect or despair. The building's unusual structure, combined with Raymond's position of authority, had allowed him to operate undetected for decades. Zachary moved out of Begich Towers 2 weeks later. He could not stay in a building where every wall might hide another secret, where every maintenance corridor might lead to another horror. He took a job in Anchorage and tried to rebuild his life, but he never quite recovered his ability to trust enclosed spaces. Some buildings, he learned, have secrets that go beyond architecture, spaces where human evil can flourish simply because nobody thinks to look behind the walls. Sophie Brennan had been a wildlife photographer for 9 years, but the assignment that brought her to the Kenai Peninsula in September was one of the most ambitious she had attempted. At 31 years old, she had built a respectable portfolio of work published in nature magazines and outdoor journals. But landing a commission from National Geographic was the breakthrough she had been chasing since she first picked up a camera. They wanted images of brown bears fishing for salmon in their natural habitat, shots that captured the raw power and beauty of Alaska's most iconic predator during the peak of the fall salmon run. She had driven down from Anchorage in her modified SUV that doubled as a mobile darkroom and camping vehicle, arriving at a remote access point along the Kenai River, where the ranger station had reported high bear activity. The location was perfect, isolated enough that she would not have to compete with tourist photographers, but accessible enough that she could get in and out safely. Sophie had done her research, read all the safety protocols, and packed bear spray, an air horn, and a satellite phone that could reach emergency services anywhere in Alaska. Her plan was to spend 4 days photographing the bears, camping in a designated site about a quarter-mile from the main fishing areas. The first 2 days went perfectly. She captured stunning images of bears standing in the rapids, salmon leaping and shimmering in their jaws, the afternoon light catching the spray of water in ways that made her heart race with the knowledge that she was getting shots that would define her career. The bears mostly ignored her, focused on the abundance of fish, and Sophie maintained the recommended distance, using her telephoto lens to bring them close without actually approaching. On the third night, she returned to her campsite just before dark and immediately knew something was wrong. Her tent, which she had carefully secured that morning, was partially collapsed. The food she had stored in a bear-proof container had been scattered across the site, though the container itself showed no signs of damage. Someone had opened it using the latch, not forced it. Her equipment cases had been moved, arranged in a line that formed an arrow pointing toward the forest. Sophie's first thought was that another photographer had stumbled on her site, maybe looking for supplies or help. But there were no other vehicles in the area, no other campsites registered with the ranger station for this section of river. She grabbed her bear spray and carefully approached the tent, calling out to announce her presence. No response. Inside the tent, she found her sleeping bag unzipped and laid flat, as if someone had examined it. Her personal journal, which she kept in a waterproof pouch at the bottom of her backpack, was sitting open on top of the sleeping bag, turned to the page where she had written her daily schedule and plans. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. This was not random animal activity. This was deliberate, methodical, someone letting her know they had been here. They knew her plans. They had access to everything she owned. Sophie grabbed her satellite phone and tried to call the ranger station, but the signal was blocked by the surrounding mountains. She would need to drive to higher ground to get through. She began breaking down her camp, working quickly as the light faded. Every sound from the forest made her freeze and listen, her imagination populating the shadows with threats. She was loading the last of her equipment into the SUV when she noticed fresh tracks in the snow near the tree line. Boot prints, large, probably a man size 11 or 12, circling her entire campsite. The tracks showed that he had stood for a long time behind a specific tree, a position that would have given him a clear view of her tent entrance. Sophie threw the rest of her gear into the vehicle and started the engine. The SUV roared to life, headlights cutting through the gathering darkness, and she put it in drive. The dirt access road back to the main highway was narrow and rough, but she had navigated it successfully on the way in. 5 miles of washboard gravel, and then she would be on pavement, able to reach the ranger station, able to call for help. She made it 2 miles before she found the tree. Someone had cut down a medium-sized spruce and dragged it across the road, completely blocking passage. The cut was fresh, sap still bleeding from the stump, and the tree was positioned in a spot where the road was too narrow to drive around it. Sophie threw the SUV into reverse and backed up, her mind racing. She could not move the tree alone, it was too large, and whoever cut it down might be watching to see what she would do. There was a secondary trail about a mile back, an unmaintained 4-wheel drive path that paralleled the river and eventually connected to a logging road. It would add miles to her journey and take her deeper into the wilderness before looping back toward civilization, but it was her only option. Sophie reached the turnoff and took it, her SUV bouncing over roots and rocks, branches scraping the sides. The trail was worse than she remembered from her map study. Several times she had to stop and clear fallen branches, her headlights creating a small bubble of visibility in the overwhelming darkness of the Alaskan forest. She was clearing one particularly large branch when she heard the engine. Another vehicle was coming up the trail behind her, moving fast, headlights bouncing crazily as it navigated the rough terrain. Sophie abandoned the branch and jumped back into her SUV, accelerating hard. The trail ahead was barely wider than her vehicle, with trees pressing in on both sides. The other vehicle was gaining, its engine louder and more powerful than her SUV. She could see it in her rearview mirror now, an old pickup truck with a reinforced front, bumper, and light bars that lit up the forest like a stadium. The truck accelerated and rammed her from behind, the impact throwing Sophie forward against her seatbelt hard enough to bruise. Her SUV fishtailed on the loose gravel, and she fought to keep it on the trail. Another impact, harder this time, and her rear windshield exploded in a shower of safety glass. Sophie pressed the accelerator to the floor, but her SUV was not built for this kind of chase. The truck was bigger, heavier, and clearly driven by someone who knew these trails better than she did. The trail opened into a small clearing, and Sophie made a desperate decision. She cranked the wheel hard right, leaving the trail entirely and plunging into the forest. Her SUV crashed through underbrush, bouncing over hidden obstacles, tree branches shattering her side mirrors. Behind her, the truck followed, its driver undeterred by the lack of a path. Then Sophie saw it, a ravine opening up ahead, maybe 15 feet across, with a steep drop on the far side. She had seconds to decide. She aimed for the narrowest point and accelerated, praying her SUV had enough momentum to clear the gap. The vehicle launched off the near side, seemed to hang in the air for an impossible moment, and slammed down on the far side with a crunch of metal and a shower of sparks. Sophie kept the accelerator down, not daring to stop and assess the damage. In her rearview mirror, she saw the truck pull up to the ravine and stop. The driver got out, a tall figure silhouetted by the headlights, and just stood there watching her crash through the forest. He made no attempt to follow, which somehow made it worse. It meant he was confident she could not escape, that these woods belonged to him and he could find her whenever he wanted. Sophie drove blind for another 10 minutes before her SUV finally gave out, the engine making sounds that meant critical damage. She grabbed her satellite phone, her camera bag with all her memory cards, and her bear spray, and continued on foot. The forest was black as pitch away from the dying headlights of her SUV, and she used her phone's flashlight function to navigate, knowing it would drain the battery but having no choice. She walked for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 2, her feet finding purchase on uneven ground through sheer luck more than visibility. Finally, her phone found a signal, just barely enough to connect to emergency services. She gave them her GPS coordinates and begged them to send help, told them someone had run her off the road and was hunting her through the forest. The dispatcher stayed on the line, telling her to find a place to hide and wait for rescue, that a helicopter was being dispatched from Anchorage. Sophie found a dense thicket of Devil's Club and burrowed into it, the thorny plants tearing at her clothes but providing concealment. She turned off her phone's light to save the battery and sat in the absolute darkness, listening to every sound the forest made, certain that any moment she would hear footsteps approaching, would see a flashlight beam cutting through the undergrowth. The helicopter found her 3 hours later, its searchlight turning the forest into day. The rescue team pulled her out of the thicket, treated her for cuts and hypothermia, and flew her to a hospital in Anchorage. State troopers searched the area for days, found her abandoned SUV and the pickup truck that had chased her, which turned out to be stolen from a hunting camp 20 miles away. They found evidence at the camp that someone had been living there off and on for years, found personal items from several people, none of whom could be located or identified. Most disturbing were the photographs, hundreds of them, stored in waterproof boxes showing campers and hikers in the area over what appeared to be a span of at least a decade. The subjects were photographed without their knowledge, going about their activities, sleeping in their tents, unaware they were being watched and documented. Sophie's face was in dozens of the most recent photos, taken over the 2 days she had been photographing bears, showing her from angles that made it clear the photographer had been very close enough to touch her without her knowing. The person who had stalked her was never identified or caught. The investigation revealed similar reports from other campers and photographers over the years, people who felt watched, who found their campsites disturbed, who saw figures moving through the forest at night. But Alaska's wilderness is vast enough to hide someone who understands how to live off the grid, who knows the terrain well enough to vanish when law enforcement starts looking. Sophie never finished the assignment for National Geographic. She could not bring herself to return to Alaska, could not even look at the images she had captured of the bears without seeing the forest around them as a threat. She moved back east, took a job teaching photography at a community college, and now only shoots in urban environments where other people are always visible. Because she knows now that the wilderness is not empty, that sometimes the most dangerous predators walk upright and carry cameras of their own, documenting their prey before they strike. Daniel Mercer had been flying bush planes in Alaska for 19 years, and in that time he thought he had seen every kind of emergency the wilderness could throw at a pilot. At 43 years old, he had survived engine failures, whiteout conditions, and landings on surfaces that barely qualified as flat ground. He had flown hunters into the Brooks Range, dropped off research teams on remote glaciers, and evacuated sick villagers from places so isolated they appeared on no roadmap. His Cessna 185 Skywagon was more than transportation. It was a lifeline connecting the scattered outposts of humanity across a landscape that still belonged more to nature than to civilization. The flight that changed everything started as a routine supply run to McCarthy, a town of fewer than 30 residents tucked into the Wrangell Mountains near the abandoned Kennecott copper mine. Daniel had made the trip dozens of times, following the Copper River north from Chitina, before banking east toward the mountains. The weather was clear for November, rare good fortune that made the spectacular scenery even more dramatic. Peaks stretched in every direction, gleaming white against a sky so blue it looked artificial. He was 20 minutes from McCarthy when the engine started making a sound that turned his blood cold, a metallic grinding, rhythmic and insistent that meant something internal was failing catastrophically. Daniel's hands moved through emergency procedures with the automatic precision of years of training. He checked gauges, adjusted fuel mixture, tried to isolate the problem, but the grinding grew louder and the engine temperature spiked into the red. The Cessna started losing altitude, Daniel scanned the terrain below, looking for anywhere flat enough to attempt a landing. The mountains offered nothing but jagged ridges and steep valleys choked with spruce and alder. He had maybe 3 minutes before the engine quit entirely, maybe less. Then he saw it. A small valley with what looked like cleared land near a cluster of buildings. Some kind of settlement. Probably abandoned mining infrastructure. It was his only option. Daniel lined up his approach, fighting the controls as the engine shuddered and died. The sudden silence was absolute, broken only by the whistle of wind over the wings. He glided the Cessna down, skimming over treetops that reached up like claws, and touched down hard on rough ground studded with rocks and scrub brush. The landing gear absorbed the impact, with sounds that suggested damage, but the plane stayed upright and rolled to a stop 50 feet from the nearest building. Daniel sat in the cockpit for a moment, his hands shaking from adrenaline, and assessed the situation. He was alive and uninjured, which put him ahead of many pilots who experienced catastrophic engine failure in these mountains. His satellite phone had signal, and he could call for pickup once he confirmed his exact location. The Cessna looked intact from what he could see, though the engine would need major work before it flew again. All things considered, he had gotten lucky. He grabbed his emergency kit and stepped out into the cold afternoon air. The settlement consisted of maybe a dozen buildings in various states of collapse, clustered around what had been a central street. Rusted mining equipment lay half-buried in decades of accumulated vegetation. A wooden sign hung crooked on a post, the letters too faded to read. The whole place had the feel of abandonment, but recent abandonment, not the century-old ghost towns that dotted other parts of Alaska. That feeling intensified when Daniel noticed smoke rising from one of the buildings. Thin and gray, barely visible against the overcast sky, but definitely smoke from a fire that was burning right now. Someone was here. Daniel approached cautiously, calling out to announce his presence. The building was a long structure that might have been a bunkhouse or mess hall, its windows intact but covered from the inside with what looked like blankets or tarps. The door opened before Daniel reached it, and a woman stepped out. She was maybe 60 years old, wearing clothes that looked handmade from animal hides and wool, her face weathered by sun and wind. She studied Daniel with an expression that was not hostile but was not welcoming either. "Plane trouble," she said. It was a statement, not a question. "Engine failure," Daniel confirmed. "I was headed to McCarthy. Is this a mining camp? I did not think anyone lived out here anymore." The woman did not answer immediately. She looked past Daniel to where the Cessna sat on the rough ground, then back to his face. "You should come inside. Weather is turning. Storm will be here by dark." Daniel had not heard any storm warnings, but he had learned to trust local knowledge. The woman stepped aside, and he entered the building. The interior was warm from a wood stove in the center of the room, and Daniel could smell food cooking, something with meat and vegetables. 3 other people sat around a rough-hewn table, 2 men and another woman, all of similar age, all wearing the same kind of handmade clothing. They watched Daniel with expressions that were difficult to read. "I am Daniel Mercer," he said, extending his hand. "I appreciate the shelter. I just need to use my satellite phone to call for pickup, and I will be out of your way." The first woman gestured to an empty chair. "Sit. Eat something. Then we talk about your phone." Something in her tone made Daniel hesitate, but the rational part of his brain dismissed his unease as paranoia. These were just people living off the grid, probably former miners or back-to-the-land types who had rejected modern society. He sat and accepted a bowl of stew that was surprisingly good, rich with chunks of meat that tasted like caribou. "How long have you been living here?" Daniel asked between bites. "Since the beginning," one of the men replied. He was older than the others, maybe 70, with a long gray beard and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at things. "We came here in 73. Thought we would mine for a season, make enough to start fresh somewhere else. But the winter came early that year. Snow closed the pass in September. We could not get out." You have been here since 1973? Daniel set down his spoon, his appetite suddenly gone. That is over 50 years. The old man nodded. Give or take, time moves different when you do not have calendars, when every day is the same work of survival. We stopped counting after a while. Daniel pulled out his satellite phone, but the woman who had first greeted him reached across and placed her hand on his. That will not work here. We are too deep in the valley. Mountains block the signal. Daniel had used satellite phones in valleys this deep before. The technology was designed to work anywhere with a view of the sky. But when he powered on the device, it showed no signal, not even a searching indicator. It was as if the satellites did not exist from this location. I will hike to higher ground, Daniel said, standing. Get above the valley rim where the signal can reach. You will not make it before dark, the old man said. And the storm is coming. Snow by nightfall, 3 feet by morning. You try to hike out now, and you freeze before you get a mile. Wait until the storm passes. Then we help you. Daniel looked at the door, calculating his options. The sun was already low, maybe 2 hours from setting. If there was a storm coming, getting caught in the open would be dangerous. But something about this situation was deeply wrong. People did not live cut off from civilization for 50 years without the world noticing. McCarthy was less than 20 miles away. Surely someone would have encountered the settlement, would have reported people living here. I need to check on my plane, Daniel said. Make sure it is secure before the weather hits. Nobody tried to stop him as he walked back outside, but he could feel them watching through the windows. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and clouds were building over the peaks, dark and heavy with snow. Daniel reached the Cessna and tried his satellite phone again, moving to different positions, holding it at different angles. Nothing. No signal, no bars. Not even an error message. Just blank static. He opened the plane's storage compartment and pulled out his emergency locator beacon, a device designed to automatically broadcast distress signals on aviation frequencies. He activated it and set it on the wing where it would have the clearest view of the sky. Then he grabbed his survival kit, his tent, and his remaining supplies. If he was stuck here until the storm passed, he would camp by the plane rather than stay in that building with people who claimed to have lived isolated for 5 decades. As Daniel was setting up his tent, the old man approached. He moved quietly for someone his age, and Daniel did not notice him until he spoke. You do not trust us, that is smart. We would not trust us either if we were you. What is going on here? Daniel asked. Who are you people really? The old man sat on a rock near the plane, his joints creaking. We are exactly who we said. 5 people who came here in the 70s looking for gold and got trapped by an early winter. But here is what we did not tell you. We found something. Not gold, but something else. In one of the old mine shafts. Something that does not want us to leave. Daniel felt the hair on his neck stand up. That does not make sense. No, it does not. But sense stopped applying to us a long time ago. Every time we tried to leave, to hike out, to flag down planes, something stopped us. Storms that came from nowhere. Equipment that failed. Injuries that kept us immobile until it was too late. We stopped trying eventually. Accepted that this valley is where we belong now. That is impossible. You are telling me something supernatural is holding you prisoner. The old man shrugged. Call it whatever you want. We call it the Guardian. It does not want the mind disturbed, does not want people knowing what is down there. So it keeps us here, makes sure we do not leave, makes sure nobody else finds this place. But you crashed here. That means either you are meant to stay or you're meant to be tested. Daniel wanted to dismiss this as the delusion of people who had been isolated too long, whose minds had created elaborate explanations for their own failure to rejoin society. But his phone still showed no signal, and the beacon on his plane should have been broadcasting, but his handheld receiver detected nothing. Something was interfering with his equipment in ways that should not be possible. The snow started falling as darkness came, heavy flakes that quickly accumulated on the ground. Daniel retreated to his tent, his sleeping bag pulled tight around him, listening to the wind pick up until it was howling through the valley like a living thing. He tried his phone periodically through the night, but it remained dead, and sleep came in fitful bursts interrupted by strange dreams of tunnels and darkness and something watching from underground. Morning brought clear skies and snowdrifts 3 feet deep, exactly as the old man had predicted. Daniel spent the day trying to dig out his plane, but the snow was too deep and his supplies too limited. The 5 people from the settlement helped him, bringing shovels and food, and as they worked, they told him more about the mine, about the shaft that went down into the mountain's heart, about the sounds they sometimes heard echoing up from those depths. 3 days passed, then a week. Daniel's supplies ran low, and he accepted food from the settlement. His satellite phone remained useless, and no search planes appeared despite the clear weather. It was as if his emergency beacon was broadcasting into a void that swallowed signals without trace. He hiked to the valley rim and found the pass the old man mentioned, but it was choked with ice and would require mountaineering equipment to traverse safely. On the 8th day, Daniel made a decision. He would not end up like these people, trapped by their own acceptance of impossible circumstances. He packed light, took only what he could carry, and started hiking west toward where he calculated the Copper River should be. If he could reach the river, he could follow it south to civilization. The 5 people watched him go but did not try to stop him. They simply stood in the settlement's central street, motionless and silent, like statues marking his departure. Daniel made it 5 miles before the storm hit, appearing out of nowhere from a sky that had been clear minutes before. The wind was so strong it knocked him off his feet, and the temperature dropped so fast his exposed skin went numb in seconds. He stumbled back toward the settlement, barely able to see through the blowing snow, his GPS showing impossible readings that placed him miles from where he knew he was. When he finally found the buildings again, hypothermic and near collapse, the 5 people brought him inside without comment or judgment. They warmed him by the fire and gave him hot food, and nobody mentioned his attempt to leave. Daniel stopped trying after that. He told himself it was temporary, that spring would bring search teams and rescue, that his insurance company would not give up on a missing pilot and aircraft. But spring came and went, then summer, and nobody arrived. The settlement existed in a pocket of reality that connections to the outside world could not penetrate. He is still there now, a 6th member of the community that lives in the shadow of something ancient that guards the mountain's secrets. Sometimes he thinks about trying to leave again, but the memory of that storm stops him. Sometimes he dreams about his life before, about flying free above the mountains, and he wakes with tears freezing on his face. Mostly he just works, hunts, survives, and tries not to think about the fact that he has become what he feared most, another forgotten soul who vanished into Alaska's wilderness and was never found. Isla Donnelly had been the curator of the Skagway Museum for 5 years, and she prided herself on knowing every artifact, every photograph, and every story in their collection. At 27 years old, she was the youngest curator the museum had ever hired, brought on specifically for her expertise in Alaska's gold rush history and her innovative approaches to digital preservation. The small town of Skagway, nestled at the northern end of the Inside Passage, had exploded during the Klondike Gold Rush of 1897, swelling from a handful of tents to a city of thousands almost overnight. Most of those fortune seekers had moved on when the gold played out, but the town's history remained, preserved in buildings and artifacts that told stories of ambition, hardship, and death. The body arrived at the museum in September, delivered on loan from the State Forensic Laboratory. It had been discovered by climate researchers studying glacial retreat near the White Pass, exposed after spending what everyone assumed was more than a century frozen in ice. The preservation was remarkable. The woman's clothing, skin, hair, Even the expression on her face remained intact, as if she had simply fallen asleep in the snow and been suspended in time. The initial assessment dated her to the gold rush era based on her clothing and a few personal effects found with the body. A locket, a small purse containing period currency, and boots that matched styles from the late 1890s. Isla was thrilled to have the body on display for the winter season. It would draw tourists even during the slow months when the cruise ships stopped coming. She set up the exhibit in the museum's climate-controlled back room, positioning the body in a specially designed case that maintained the sub-zero temperatures necessary to prevent decomposition. The display included historical context about the dangers of the White Pass Trail, how hundreds of stampeders had died attempting the crossing, and how many bodies remained undiscovered in the glaciers and snowfields. The first hint that something was wrong came when the forensic report arrived 2 weeks after the body was installed. Isla was alone in the museum, going through her evening closing routine when she opened the email attachment and started reading. The report contained DNA analysis, dental comparisons, and isotope testing that should have confirmed the body's age and origin. Instead, it revealed something impossible. The woman had died approximately 10 years ago, not a century. The carbon dating of her tissues, the composition of her dental work, and the presence of synthetic fibers in her clothing that had been mistaken for period-appropriate materials all pointed to a death that occurred sometime around 2015. But her appearance, her dress, even the currency in her purse were authentic to the 1890s. Someone had either gone to extraordinary lengths to recreate period accuracy, or something far stranger had occurred. Isla sat in her office, rereading the report 3 times, trying to make sense of the findings. She pulled up missing persons databases and started searching for women who had disappeared in the Skagway area between 2010 and 2020. There were several, but none matched the physical description of the body. She was about to call the state police when she noticed the envelope. It sat on her desk, plain white paper with no stamp or return address. Just her name written in elaborate cursive script that looked like it came from another era. Isla was certain it had not been there when she arrived that morning. She opened it carefully and pulled out a single sheet of paper covered in the same ornate handwriting. The letter was addressed to her and dated September 15, 1898. It described a woman named Catherine Morrow, who had come to Skagway seeking her fortune, who had found employment in a dance hall, and who had learned secrets that powerful men wanted kept buried. The letter claimed Catherine had discovered evidence of murders committed during the gold rush, bodies hidden in places where they would never be found, and fortunes stolen from men who disappeared without trace. Catherine had tried to bring this evidence to authorities, but the men she accused were the authorities. So they silenced her, dressed her in period clothing, and left her body in the glacier, where she would eventually be discovered and dismissed as just another casualty of the gold rush. The letter concluded with a warning. Those who seek to uncover the truth about Catherine Morrow will face the same silence she did. Some secrets are meant to stay buried with the dead. Isla's hands shook as she set the letter down. This had to be a hoax, someone's elaborate prank, or an attempt to create mystery around the exhibit to drive attendance. But the handwriting, the paper quality, even the ink looked authentic to the period. She photographed the letter and sent copies to a colleague who specialized in historical document analysis, asking for verification. That night, Isla could not sleep. She kept thinking about the body in the climate-controlled case, about a woman who had died just 10 years ago but was dressed and presented as if from another century, about someone who had gone to tremendous effort to make her death look historical, about a letter that should not exist, warning her to stop investigating. The second letter arrived 3 days later, slipped under the museum's front door sometime during the night. This one was more direct. You have been asking questions about Catherine. Stop. The families involved still have influence in this town. They will not allow their ancestors' crimes to be exposed. This is your only warning. Isla took both letters to Chief Bronson at the Skagway Police Department. He listened to her story with an expression that suggested he thought she was overreacting, but he agreed to look into it. Background checks on prominent families from the Gold Rush era revealed that several descendants still lived in the area, still owned substantial property, and still wielded considerable economic influence. But Bronson found no evidence of criminal activity, no reason to believe anyone was threatening Isla beyond the letters. Probably just someone who does not like the exhibit, Bronson said, handing the letters back. You know how people get about displaying human remains. Could be a descendant who is uncomfortable with their ancestor being on public view. But the body was not from the Gold Rush era. That was the whole point. Someone had killed a woman in the past decade and staged it to look historical. Isla tried to explain this to Bronson, but he seemed more interested in wrapping up the conversation than investigating further. That night, Isla stayed late at the museum, reviewing every piece of evidence connected to the body. She photographed the clothing, examined the locket, and studied the currency. Everything looked authentic, but the forensic report was clear. This was a modern death disguised as historical tragedy. She was so focused on her research that she did not notice the time until the power went out. The museum went dark instantly, the climate control systems shutting down with a mechanical sigh. Isla fumbled for her phone's flashlight and made her way to the breaker box, but the switches were all in the correct position. The power company must have lost a line somewhere. She called the emergency number and was told they had no reports of outages in Skagway. The power should be working. Isla returned to the exhibit room, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The temperature was already rising without the climate control, and she could hear water beginning to drip from the case that held Catherine Morrow's body. If the power did not come back soon, the body would start to thaw and decompose. Days of preservation work would be ruined. She approached the case to assess the damage and froze. The body's eyes were open. Isla was certain they had been closed when she installed the exhibit, certain because she had specifically checked to ensure the woman looked peaceful. But now the eyes stared directly at her, reflecting her flashlight beam with an intensity that made her step backward. The temperature in the room continued to rise, and Isla heard a cracking sound. The ice that had formed around the body was beginning to break apart. She needed to get the power restored immediately, needed to call someone who could help preserve the exhibit, but her phone showed no signal, and when she tried the museum's landline, it was dead. Isla ran for the front door, but it would not open. The electronic locks had engaged when the power went out, and the manual override was not responding. She was trapped in the museum with a body that was rapidly thawing and eyes that seemed to follow her movements in the darkness. She heard footsteps above her, on the second floor where the administrative offices were located. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the rooms. Isla called out, asking if someone was there, if they could help her get the door open. The footsteps stopped, and then a voice responded, muffled and distant. Catherine Morrow died because she would not stop asking questions. You're making the same mistake she did. Isla's flashlight beam shook as she swept it across the room, looking for another exit. The windows were too small to climb through, and the fire exits were chained from the outside, a violation she had been meaning to report but had never gotten around to addressing. The footsteps started again, descending the stairs toward her location. She grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and positioned herself behind a display case, her breath coming in short gasps. The footsteps reached the ground floor and moved toward the exhibit room. Isla saw a shadow pass in the doorway, saw a figure holding something that caught the faint moonlight from the windows. A knife, long and curved, the kind used for gutting fish. The figure entered the room, and Isla recognized the face. It was Thomas Halford, a prominent local businessman whose family had owned property in Skagway since the gold rush. He had donated extensively to the museum over the years, had served on the board of directors. He smiled when he saw her hiding, the expression cold and predatory. My great-great-grandfather killed Catherine Morrow because she discovered he had murdered 17 people for their gold claims," Thomas said conversationally. "He took their fortunes and built the family wealth that I enjoy today. Catherine was going to expose him, ruin everything. So he silenced her and the secret stayed buried for over a century. Until climate change exposed her body. Scylla finished, understanding now. And the forensic analysis would reveal she died recently. Not in the 1890s. Would prove your family's crimes." Thomas nodded. "We could not have that. So we created the narrative of a gold rush victim, planted evidence, controlled the investigation. It would have worked perfectly if you had just accepted the official story. But you kept digging, kept asking questions, just like Catherine." Isla threw the fire extinguisher at him and ran, ducking through the door and racing toward the back of the museum. She could hear Thomas behind her, his footsteps quick and confident. He knew this building as well as she did, knew every room and exit. But Isla knew something he did not. The museum had a coal chute from when the building was heated with coal, a narrow tunnel that led to the street. It had been sealed decades ago, but Isla had noticed during a recent inspection that the seal was failing, that someone could potentially squeeze through if they were desperate enough. She found the access door in the basement storage room and wrenched it open. The chute was barely 2 feet square, angled steeply upward, thick with dust and cobwebs. Isla squeezed inside and started climbing, her hands finding purchase on ancient coal residue, her knees scraping against brick. Behind her, Thomas reached the chute entrance and realized what she was doing. "You will not make it," he called up. "The exit is still sealed. You will be trapped in there." But Isla kept climbing, kept moving upward through the darkness until her head hit the metal cover at the top. She pushed with all her strength, felt it shift slightly, pushed again. The rusted bolts gave way, and the cover flew open, and Isla pulled herself out onto the sidewalk, gasping for air. She ran to the police station covered in coal dust and bleeding from dozens of scrapes, and told Chief Bronson everything. Thomas Halford was arrested that night at his home, and a search warrant revealed evidence connecting him to Catherine Morrow's actual death. She had been a private investigator, researching his family's history, had uncovered documents proving the Gold Rush murders, and had threatened to publish her findings. The Glacier death had been Thomas's solution, a way to hide a modern murder by disguising it as historical tragedy. The Halford family's fortune was built on 17 murders, and the truth finally came out 127 years after the crimes were committed. Isla testified at the trial, helped prosecute the case, and watched Thomas Halford convicted of murder. But she never returned to work at the museum. Some historical mysteries, she learned, have teeth, and uncovering them requires a willingness to face dangers that span generations. Hunter McKay had worked commercial fishing boats out of Kotzebue for 14 years, and in that time he thought he understood the risks that came with the job. At 39 years old, he captained a 32-foot trawler named the Arctic Breeze, running herring and cod up to the processing plants during the season. The work was brutal, the hours were long, and the Chukchi Sea was unforgiving, but it paid better than anything else available in the remote Arctic town. Hunter had a wife and 2 kids in Anchorage who depended on the money he sent home, and he told himself every season would be his last before he found something safer, something that did not require weeks away from his family in waters that could kill you in minutes if something went wrong. The storm hit in early November, one of those Arctic blasts that came screaming down from the Bering Strait with wind speeds that turned the sea into a chaos of whitecaps and spray. Hunter had the Arctic Breeze tied up at the commercial dock in Kotzebue, waiting out the weather along with a dozen other fishing vessels. The harbor was relatively protected, sheltered by a breakwater that absorbed most of the wave energy, but the wind was strong enough to make the boats strain against their mooring lines, and the temperature was dropping fast, well below zero even before factoring in wind chill. Hunter was in the cabin doing maintenance on his navigation equipment when he heard the shouting. He climbed up on deck and saw people gathered at the far end of the dock, pointing toward a boat that was moored 3 slips down from his position. The vessel was a converted cargo trawler called the Northern Star, bigger than most of the fishing boats, with a crew of 5, according to the harbor master's records. But something was clearly wrong. The boat sat lower in the water than it should, and Hunter could see movement on deck that looked frantic and disorganized. He grabbed his heavy parka and made his way down the dock, fighting the wind that threatened to knock him off his feet. By the time he reached the Northern Star, a small crowd had gathered, and someone had already called the Coast Guard. Hunter climbed aboard without waiting for permission and found a scene that made no sense. 2 crew members were on deck, both dead, their bodies showing signs of massive trauma. One man had been shot in the chest at close range, the wound still bleeding, suggesting he had died within the past few minutes. The other had been beaten to death, his face so damaged that Hunter could not identify his features. The captain of a nearby boat climbed aboard behind Hunter, a grizzled fisherman named Jacobson, who had been working these waters since the 60s. "What the hell happened here?" Jacobson asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. Hunter shook his head, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. "We need to check below deck. There are supposed to be 5 crew on this boat." They descended into the cabin area, moving carefully, and found another body in the galley. This one was a woman, maybe 30 years old, wearing a blood-soaked sweatshirt. She had been stabbed multiple times, defensive wounds on her hands suggesting she had tried to fight off her attacker. The galley showed signs of a struggle, dishes smashed on the floor, table overturned, blood splattered across multiple surfaces. "We need to get off this boat," Jacobson said, backing toward the stairs. Whoever did this might still be aboard. But Hunter had seen something that made him pause. A logbook sat open on the galley table, and the most recent entries were dated today. He grabbed it and started reading, his eyes widening as he took in the contents. The entries described a smuggling operation, packages being moved from Russian waters into Alaska, transactions involving people Hunter recognized as prominent business owners in Kotzebue. The operation had been running for years, moving contraband that the entries referred to only as special cargo, but that Hunter suspected was drugs or weapons or both. The final entry was written in a shaking hand, clearly composed in haste. "They know we talked. Marcus saw us with the federal agent in Nome last week. They're coming to clean up loose ends. If anyone finds this, the people responsible are..." The entry ended mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted. Hunter heard a sound behind him and spun around to find a man standing in the doorway. He was tall and heavy, wearing a dark jacket and holding a pistol that was pointed directly at Hunter's chest. Hunter recognized him immediately. Marcus Severn, who owned the fuel depot and marine supply store in Kotzebue, who served on the town council and sponsored the high school hockey team. A pillar of the community, and apparently a murderer. "Put down the logbook, Hunter," Marcus said, his voice eerily calm despite the wind howling outside. "This does not need to involve you. These people made a mistake. They tried to cooperate with federal investigators, thought they could get immunity by turning on the operation. But there is too much money involved, too many people who depend on this business continuing, so we had to send a message." Hunter set the logbook down slowly, his mind racing through options. He was unarmed, trapped below deck, with a man who had already killed at least 3 people tonight. Jacobson was nowhere to be seen, probably already off the boat and calling for help. But help was 30 minutes away at minimum, maybe longer in this storm. Coast Guard would need time to mobilize, time that Hunter did not have. "Marcus, think about what you are doing," Hunter said, keeping his voice level. "People saw us come aboard. You shoot me, and there's no way to explain it away, too many witnesses." Marcus shook his head. "The storm will provide cover. Boats break free in weather like this. People fall overboard. Accidents happen. By the time anyone sorts out what really occurred here, the evidence will be scattered across the Arctic Ocean, and I will have a dozen people vouching for my whereabouts." He gestured with the gun toward the stairs. Up on deck, You are going to help me sink this boat, and then you are going to have an unfortunate accident trying to get back to shore in this weather." Hunter climbed the stairs with Marcus behind him, the gun never wavering from his back. On deck, the storm had intensified, and visibility was down to maybe 50 feet. The other boats were barely visible through the blowing snow, ghostly shapes straining at their moorings. Marcus directed Hunter to the stern where the Northern Star's small inflatable dinghy was stored. "Get it in the water," Marcus ordered. "We are taking it out past the breakwater. Too many people watching the harbor. Need to make this look natural." Hunter lowered the dinghy, his hands numb from the cold, his mind desperately searching for any opportunity to turn the situation in his favor. Once they were past the breakwater, in the open water beyond the protected harbor, his chances of survival dropped to nearly zero. The water temperature was maybe 30 degrees, and the waves outside the harbor would be 12 feet or higher. Even if he somehow escaped Marcus, he would die from hypothermia within minutes. The dinghy hit the water with a slap, and Marcus climbed in first, keeping the gun trained on Hunter. "Get in and start the motor. Head northeast toward the ice pack." Hunter climbed into the dinghy and pulled the starter cord on the small outboard motor. It caught on the third pull, sputtering to life with a sound that was barely audible over the storm. He pointed the boat toward the harbor entrance, navigating between the moored vessels, watching the breakwater approach with growing desperation. They passed the last marker buoy and entered the open water beyond, and the dinghy immediately started bucking in the waves. Marcus had to grab the gunnel with his free hand to keep from being thrown out, and for just a moment, the barrel of his gun dipped away from Hunter. That was all the opening Hunter needed. He threw himself sideways, knocking Marcus off balance, and grabbed for the gun. They wrestled in the bottom of the dinghy, the small boat spinning in the waves, taking on water with each impact. Hunter felt his fingers close around Marcus's wrist, felt the gun barrel pressed between their bodies, and then it discharged with a muffled boom that seemed impossibly loud despite the storm. Marcus went limp, his eyes wide with shock, blood spreading across his jacket from a wound in his abdomen. The gun fell from his fingers into the water, pooling in the bottom of the dinghy. Hunter pushed himself away, gasping, his ears ringing from the gunshot. Marcus tried to speak, blood bubbling from his lips, and then his eyes rolled back and he collapsed completely. Hunter grabbed the motor's tiller and turned the dinghy back toward the harbor, fighting waves that threatened to capsize them with every swell. It took 15 minutes to reach the breakwater, 15 minutes during which Hunter was certain the overloaded dinghy would sink, or that Marcus would wake up and attack him again. But the boat held together, and Marcus remained unconscious, bleeding out onto the deck. The Coast Guard cutter was just entering the harbor when Hunter made it back to the dock. Medics took Marcus into custody, though he died before they could get him to the clinic. The investigation that followed revealed the extent of the smuggling operation, how it had operated for over a decade with the complicity of several prominent Kotzebue residents. The Northern Star's crew had indeed been cooperating with federal investigators, and Marcus had been sent to eliminate them before they could testify before a grand jury. Hunter's testimony helped prosecute 7 people, including 2 members of the town council and the harbor master himself. The operation had moved millions of dollars worth of contraband through the remote Arctic port, counting on the isolation and the tight-knit community to keep people from asking too many questions. But 3 people had died trying to bring it down, and Hunter still wakes up some nights thinking about that ride through the storm, about how close he came to being the 4th victim. He left commercial fishing after that season, took a job with the state Fish and Wildlife Department that keeps him on land most of the time. His family moved back to Kotzebue after the trial, and he coaches his son's hockey team, trying to rebuild the community trust that the smuggling ring destroyed. But he never goes near the harbor anymore, cannot look at the boats tied up at the dock without remembering the Northern Star and the bodies he found below deck, without feeling the weight of the logbook that saved his life and condemned 7 others. Livia Ramsey had owned the Midnight Sun Roadhouse in Chicken, Alaska for 7 years, and she prided herself on running the kind of establishment where locals and travelers alike could find hot food, cold beer, and a place to escape the isolation that defined life this far north. At 33 years old, she had bought the roadhouse with money from a settlement after her husband died in an oil rig accident, and she had poured everything into making it successful. Chicken was barely a town, maybe 17 permanent residents scattered across the surrounding wilderness, but it sat at the intersection of the top of the World Highway and the Taylor Highway, which meant enough traffic during summer months to keep her business viable. The trouble started in October, during the weeks leading up to the polar night when darkness began to dominate the days and the sun made only brief appearances above the horizon. Olivia had experienced 5 winters in Chicken, and she understood the psychological toll that months of darkness could take. People got strange when the light disappeared, their moods shifting, their behavior becoming unpredictable. The Inuit had a word for it, perloronic, a kind of winter darkness madness that could afflict anyone who spent too long without sunlight. The first vehicle appeared on a Tuesday night, pulling into the roadhouse parking lot around 10 in the evening when the place was nearly empty. Olivia was behind the bar, cleaning glasses and preparing to close for the night when she heard the engine. She looked through the window and saw an old pickup truck, maybe from the 80s, sitting with its engine running and headlights illuminating the front of the building. Nobody got out. The truck just sat there, idling, its occupant invisible behind windshield glass that reflected the roadhouse's exterior lights. After 10 minutes, Olivia went outside to see if the driver needed help. The temperature was already below 0, and she could see her breath crystallizing in the air. But when she approached the truck, it suddenly reversed, backed out of the parking lot, and disappeared down the Taylor Highway toward the Canadian border. The whole encounter lasted maybe 15 seconds. Not long enough for Olivia to get a look at the driver, or even determine if the vehicle had license plates. She thought little of it at the time. Strange people did strange things in Alaska, and someone sitting in a truck outside her roadhouse was far from the weirdest thing she had witnessed. But the next night, the truck returned at the exact same time. 10 o'clock, pulling into the parking lot, engine idling, headlights pointed at the building. Olivia went outside again, and again the truck reversed and drove away the moment she approached. This pattern continued for 5 consecutive nights. Always the same truck, always at 10 o'clock, always leaving when Olivia came outside. On the 6th night, she called Morris, the closest thing Chicken had to law enforcement, a retired state trooper who lived in a cabin 8 miles down the road and handled minor disputes and disturbances. Morris drove over in his ancient Jeep and waited with Olivia until 10 o'clock. The truck did not appear that night, but Morris agreed to ask around, see if anyone recognized the vehicle description. 2 nights later, the pattern changed. Olivia was closing the roadhouse around 11 when she noticed fresh footprints in the snow leading from the tree line to the back of the building. Large boot prints, maybe a size 12 or 13, stopping at each window and then continuing around the perimeter of the roadhouse before returning to the forest. Someone had been circling her property, looking in windows, and the prints were fresh enough that it must have happened within the past hour while she was inside serving her last customers. Olivia called Morris again, and this time he came over with his rifle and helped her check the property. They found where the person had stood for an extended period behind a particular spruce tree, the snow packed down from their weight, positioned to give a clear view through the roadhouse's main dining room window. Morris took photographs of the boot prints and promised to increase his patrols, but both of them understood the limitations. Chicken covered a huge geographic area with almost no population, and Morris was one man in his 70s trying to monitor hundreds of square miles. The sightings escalated after that. Other residents began reporting similar experiences. Jake, who lived in a trailer near the abandoned mining equipment on the edge of town, saw someone standing at the edge of his property at 3 in the morning, just standing perfectly still and watching his trailer. Sarah, who ran the general store, found boot prints around her building that matched the ones at the roadhouse. Most disturbing were the reports from the Hendersons, a couple in their 60s who lived in the most remote cabin, 5 miles from the roadhouse. They woke up one night to find someone had been inside their mudroom while they slept, had stood there in the darkness doing nothing, just standing and waiting. They only knew because their motion-activated camera had captured a figure in dark clothing, face obscured by a hood, standing in the corner for over an hour before leaving without taking anything. Morris organized a town meeting at the roadhouse, and 15 people showed up, nearly the entire permanent population of Chicken. They compared experiences and tried to find patterns. The figure always appeared between 10 at night and 4 in the morning. It never approached closer than the tree line or the edge of properties. It never tried to communicate or enter occupied buildings. It just watched perfectly still, like a predator observing prey before deciding whether to strike. Someone suggested it might be a bear, but bears did not wear boots or drive trucks. Someone else mentioned Perlerornek, the winter madness, suggesting maybe one of them was sleepwalking or experiencing shared delusions brought on by the darkness. But the boot prints were real, the truck was real, and the photographs from the Henderson's camera showed something undeniably human. As November deepened and the daylight hours dwindled to nothing, the encounters became more frequent and more disturbing. The figure began appearing inside the town's boundaries, no longer staying at the perimeter, but moving through Chicken itself. Olivia saw it twice, once standing at the edge of her parking lot at exactly 3:17 in the morning, and once standing on the roof of the general store, silhouetted against the stars. Both times the figure stood perfectly motionless, and both times it vanished the moment Olivia tried to approach or call out. Then the customers started reporting the same thing. A trucker who stopped overnight saw the figure standing beside his rig when he went out for a cigarette. A couple driving through on their way to Fairbanks saw it standing in the middle of the highway, forcing them to swerve, and when they looked back, it was gone. A group of hunters staying at the roadhouse woke up to find boot prints leading from the forest to the window of their room, where someone had stood and watched them sleep. Morris finally contacted the state police, but they had no resources to spare for what they categorized as a nuisance complaint in an unincorporated area. They suggested the residents form a neighborhood watch and call emergency services if the figure actually committed a crime. But watching was all it did. It never broke into buildings, never stole anything, never harmed anyone. It just appeared always during the darkest hours, always standing and observing, and always at exactly 3:17 in the morning, according to everyone who checked the time. Olivia started keeping a shotgun behind the bar and sleeping in the roadhouse's back room rather than driving home to her cabin. Other residents began leaving lights on all night, installing cameras and motion sensors, boarding up windows they did not need. The darkness that had always been a manageable part of life in the Arctic suddenly felt oppressive and threatening, filled with something that defied explanation. In early December, during the deepest part of the polar night, Olivia had an encounter that forced her to confront the possibility that what was stalking Chicken might not be entirely human. She was doing inventory in the roadhouse's walk-in freezer when the door swung shut behind her, something that should have been impossible because she had propped it open with a heavy box. The interior light went out, and she was plunged into absolute darkness and cold that immediately began leaching the warmth from her body. Olivia fumbled for her phone and used its flashlight to find the emergency release handle. But when she pulled it, nothing happened. The door remained sealed. She pounded on the metal, screaming for help even though she knew nobody else was in the building. The temperature in the freezer was -10 degrees, and she was wearing only jeans and a flannel shirt. She had maybe 30 minutes before hypothermia became critical, maybe less. That was when she heard the breathing, not from outside the freezer, but inside, with her, coming from the corner where she kept boxes of frozen vegetables. Slow, measured breaths that created no visible condensation despite the cold. Olivia swung her phone's light toward the sound and saw the figure standing in the corner, wearing dark clothing, face hidden by a hood. It had been in the freezer the entire time, waiting for her. The figure stepped forward, and Olivia could finally see beneath the hood. What she saw made her scream, made her pound on the door with renewed desperation, made her willing to risk dying in the attempt to escape. The face was human, but wrong. Features that almost matched normal proportions but were subtly distorted, like looking at a reflection in water that had been disturbed. The eyes were the worst, black from edge to edge, no whites visible, reflecting her phone's light like an animal's. The door suddenly opened, and Morris stood there, holding his rifle. He pulled Olivia out, and she collapsed in the hallway, gasping and crying. Morris swept the freezer with his rifle and flashlight, but it was empty. No figure, no boot prints in the frost on the floor, no evidence anyone had been inside except Olivia. The next morning, Olivia closed the roadhouse. She packed her essential belongings, locked the doors, and drove to Fairbanks, where she checked into a hotel and refused to return until spring. Other residents did the same, abandoning Chicken during the darkest weeks of winter, something that had never happened in the town's history. The handful who stayed reported that the figure continued to appear, but less frequently, as if it had lost interest when most of the population fled. When Olivia finally returned in March, when the sun had resumed its presence above the horizon, the roadhouse was exactly as she had left it. Nothing disturbed, nothing taken, just months of accumulated silence and dust. She reopened for business, and life returned to something resembling normal. The figure did not appear during the summer months, and some residents convinced themselves it had been a shared delusion, winter madness magnified by isolation. But Olivia knows better. Every October, as the darkness begins its annual conquest of the Arctic, she starts preparing. She closes the roadhouse every winter now, refuses to stay in Chicken during the polar night, refuses to be there when 317 rolls around, and something that is not quite human emerges from the forest to watch and wait and remember, because she looked into those eyes in the freezer, and she understood with absolute certainty that whatever walks through Chicken during the darkest months is patient and persistent, and that one winter, when the conditions are right and the darkness is deep enough, it will stop watching and start taking what it came for.